Welcome to The General and the Journalist from The Times and The Sunday Times. The old order is breaking down. Conflict is on the rise, and each week we try to help you understand it all. I'm the journalist part of the equation, Tom Newton-Dunn. The general part, General Sir Patrick Sanders, is away this week, enjoying some sunshine. So I'm launching my own coup d'etat and inviting on another journalist to make it, for 1 week only, The Journalist and the Journalist. Certainly ring tonight, I think. And the journalist I have with me now is one of the best journalists we have, the multiple award-winning Anthony Loyd, who's worked as a war correspondent for The Times for some 32 years. Welcome, Anthony.
Tom, thank you very much. May I add that if I was still in the army, I would certainly be a general.
I'm sure you...
Patrick might disagree.
We're going to get to that. I hope I thoroughly embarrassed you with that disgusting introduction, though.
No, you did, of course.
It's really good if you come in, not least because you're going to Ukraine tomorrow. So I'm really, really grateful for your time. I honestly don't know anybody on the planet who knows more about covering wars. So you really are the right man to talk to for the subject that we want to get into. And it's something that's actually puzzled me personally for some time. I suspect you too, well, you might have a better idea of it. And it's why are some wars of huge interest to the public and others not? What is it about certain conflicts that really catch the public's emotional attention, and what is it about others just don't? And I think the one thing we know is it's not about the levels of suffering, because one war can see a handful of fatalities and get huge amounts of media coverage, while others can kill literally hundreds of thousands and get largely ignored. So why is it? You're the best man for the job, Anthony. But let's just introduce you gently to the listeners. How many wars have you covered in total in your 32 years? You probably lost count.
I have slightly lost count, Tom. I'd say it's probably about 15 big wars and a few insurgencies and bits of unrest and civil collapse. Yeah, Afghanistan, I would have spent probably about 2.5, 3 years in total of my life since 1997. And Iraq, I would have spent quite a lot of time in my life, really, since I first went there in 1991. And Bosnia, I lived there throughout the war, so that would have been 3.5 years. I've spent years and years of my life since I was 25 in wars.
Syria you spent a long time in as well. We were shot twice.
Yeah, taking it for the team the same day. Anyway,
Afghanistan was where you and I met, though. I mean, we've come across each other over the years in various sort of bits and bobs. You may or may not remember this, but our paths... I bet you only do because I told you about it before we started recording.
I do remember.
So it was Chicken Street in downtown Kabul, and for those who haven't been there, it's where sort of the serviceable restaurants were. And it was December 2001. I was about 2 days into Kabul. Obviously, the war against the Taliban was still raging. Kabul had been liberated a couple of months earlier. I was 2 days in. It was my first ever war zone I'd been to. I was green as you like. William Boot from Scoop, the sort of ingenue war correspondent. I had all sorts of items of clothing and equipment packed that I had no idea how to use and never did use. And we went out for dinner, and there was you and another war reporter, but someone who'd been around for quite a time. He'd been 8 years into the job then. I had to say I was completely in awe of you and felt even greener by the end of our conversation.
I remember that stuff very well. Yeah, I was with a friend, Julius Strauss, who was... I can't remember if he was working for a rival organisation at the time, maybe so, but where we were old friends and remained good friends. And I remember the winter of 2001.
Our styles of reporting, though, been different. I think largely because we'd done sort of different jobs, and I've obviously covered politics for a long while, but before then I was a defence correspondent, and that meant covering militaries. So a lot of my reporting was basically on embeds with various militaries, the British military being the main one. You're a foreign correspondent, stroke conflict war correspondent, and by and large, you don't do your business via embeds. You're out there alone. And they're two quite different disciplines, aren't they?
Sometimes in some conflicts, you have to embed with local forces. It can be the only way as a journalist, particularly as a foreign journalist, that you get to reach a particular area of the war. And without an embed, you might never get there at all. You might be killed by the other side before you do. If I can cover a war without doing an embed, then that is my preferred way, because you have much more freedom. You're far less exposed to the dictates and aspirations of the side who you're embedded with, and it allows you, far more freedom to roam. And
it's also a lot more dangerous, especially the sort of years you and I had to spend in these sort of countries.
Yeah, when you're embedded, particularly if you're embedded with Western Army, I mean, they look after you. They feed you. If anything goes wrong and you get hurt, they've got a system that's going to extract you and look after you. But when you're roaming around, if you're with an insurgent group, I suppose the term embedded, no, it couldn't really apply.
It's a horrible phrase, isn't
yeah,
it?
it's
Let's
horrible.
say that now. It's a disgusting phrase.
But, traveling
Embed
around with an irregular army, non-embedded, and with room to roam is my preferred way of reporting, because you get a far more kind of transparent look on what's going on.
So you then personally, you went to school, you went to Eton, then Sandhurst, and as you said, you were originally an army officer. And this is my moment. I have to say, I've been looking for this for some time. You're in the Royal Green Jackets. That was a British Army Infantry Regiment, and the very same regiment as one Patrick Sanders. And you were almost direct contemporaries. You were both young lieutenants together.
Yeah, I think, being honest, I was perhaps second lieutenant when Patrick was a lieutenant. He's got a couple of years on me, but not much more than that. And
So what was he like? Was he any good?
Yeah, I'll tell you something. I don't think he's an establishment figure. And that sounds very weird when you think about a general. You're like, well, they're going to be the epitome of an establishment figure. And I don't think Patrick's an establishment figure in his heart. And that is what makes him good. I think generals have become too much part of the establishment, get very narrowed and predictable. And I don't think Patrick is a narrow or predictable guy.
Did you know that at the time when you were?
Yeah, he was cool. He was good fun to hang out with. There were a lot of people who weren't fun to hang out with in the army. There were a lot of pompous, and there was also some good people, some smart people. It was very different. It was a much more intelligent organisation than I predicted. I met some great people in the army. I was only there for 5 years. I remember Patrick well, and then our paths crossed in various wars after that: Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq.
Well, look, Patrick is actually quite peeved that I've got you on when he's not here, because he wants to go down memory lane with you, and we may actually do that in a later episode if you're kind enough to come back. But briefly, when I spoke to him a few days back, he did say you were a great guy who was always up for it. He didn't define what up for was exactly, but
that's fine. I'll deal with that. Yeah, I'll take that.
So you weren't in the army too long. How did you become a war correspondent?
I'd always only ever wanted to be in the army for a short period of time. I wanted the experience of it, and I kind of needed the experience of it as well.
What do you mean you needed the experience?
Because I was very young when I joined the army. I was 18 years old, and I'd actually left Eton when I was 15 and gone off to college, and I was, I'd kind of dropped out of college. I didn't have the right A-levels to do anything, go to university. I wanted to be a soldier, and I wanted to toughen myself up a bit, and I got that out of the army. And I got enough confidence out of the army so that after I left, which I always knew I was going to do after a maximum of 5 years, I wanted to be a war correspondent, but it wasn't as easy as just writing to a paper and saying, hey, I want to be a war correspondent. Can I go off to the war in Bosnia, which was then beginning?
Why leave the army when your job is to fight wars? You've got it on
Because the army hadn't been in wars. I mean, God, by the time I left the army, if you looked at the span of the last 20 years, the wars had been in with the Falklands in 1982, the first Gulf War in 1991, which I had been in. And so, these were the days, it was tail end of the Cold War. It's quite a boring time to be a soldier. And so with my logic, I thought, I'm going to leave the army now, because principally it's quite boring. And I want to be a war correspondent. I've been very influenced by a book written by Michael Hare called Dispatches, about his time as a correspondent in Vietnam. I read that when I was about 15. It was all about war correspondents riding around in helicopters, listening to Jimi Hendrix, smoking weed. And I thought, that sounds great, it's the job. And it hasn't quite been like that, more or less. Not so much Jimi Hendrix these days. And anyway, that's what I wanted to do. So I left the army. Of course, did write a letter to newspapers saying, hey, please, can I be a correspondent, go off to Bosnia where the war was breaking out? And
sort of early, mid-90s.
Yeah, this is 1992. It began, spring of 92. And I studied photojournalism at London College of Printing for a year. And then I hitchhiked to Bosnia and got a breakout there. But I only really, if I hadn't been a soldier, I don't think I would have hitchhiked there. It would have been like, my God, what, you're going to hitchhike to war and you don't know anybody and you're going to hope to be a war correspondent. But it did help, having done 5 years in the army, thinking, okay, that's a bit of an undertaking, but I can probably manage it.
So you're in Bosnia without an employer, How did you get your big break?
It was a guy, Patrick Bishop, who was venerated
Great guy.
Telegraph correspondent who was wounded one day by a Claymore mine. And I wasn't with him when he was wounded, but someone told me, look, he's been wounded and we're not sure whether he's dead or alive or what's happened to him. So I was in a car with a French friend, a photographer, and to try and find Patrick, and we drove into this. It wasn't an ambush, it was just two sides fighting, Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Muslim army, or Bosnian army, largely Muslim, as I should say, more accurately, were fighting across this roadway just as we drove through it. So we had to abandon our car, and then in the middle of it all, the Bosnians pulled out these two young Croatian soldiers weeping from a house. They took them prisoner. I remember the Croats had these chest webbing on them, and one had a very kind of handsome bone-handled knife. The Bosnian army weren't nearly as well equipped. They were delighted to have captured these two prisoners, and they took the gear off them and put it on themselves. And the two prisoners got led away. The firefight continued. It was summer, I remember, and the machine gun fire going above us was taking all the foliage down over our heads. Literally, there was a kind of salad clatter all around us as leaves and branches were coming down. And in true Bosnian style, in the middle of all this fighting, a barn was on fire and a calf wandered out of the barn. And for these soldiers, they're like, brilliant, here's lunch. So they killed the calf using the bone-handled knife they'd just taken off a Croat prisoner, grilled it on bits of the burning barn as this firefight was still going on throughout other Arab bits of this village. And then this tall, red-haired soldier who had the knife offered me, I thought was a morsel of veal. And he dropped it into my hand, and it was a woman's severed ear.
Jesus.
Which he had found in the chest webbing, captured from these two Croat guys, one of whom had the bone-handled knife. So we're now slicing the veal with this knife that had been used in this practice of kind of desecration of the dead, war trophies and severed ears was quite widespread in some areas at the time. To cut a long story short, I did make it back that day. I found that Patrick had been sprayed up, I think right or left side of his body by shrapnel, not in too dramatic a way, but badly enough, from a Claymore mine. And he said, hey, look, I'm leaving to get patched up. It's going to be some time before his paper, The Telegraph, could get someone else in. Could I cover for them in the meantime? And I said, yeah, sure. By the way, something really weird happened on the way to find you today. I told him roughly as I've told you now. And he said, that's great, just write it longhand, dictate it down my sat phone, or a sat phone that he had access to. And then I did. That was the first story I ever had published. It was unchanged, not one word. It was just written longhand on a piece of paper, dictated to someone down a sat phone. And that was it. And I got a gig briefly with them, and then the Times picked me up out there. That was my break.
I don't think I've ever filed a single story anywhere that hadn't been changed by the subs because it wasn't very good. So you can obviously write better than I can, which
more war
very
mutilation.
And you also read a book about your time during the Bosnian War, a brilliant book, because I read at the time, actually, I loved My War Gone By, I Miss It So. Where was the title from? I've always wanted to ask you that. Why did you call it that?
Oh, those words were mine. They're at the end of the first chapter, and I was trying to conjure this feeling of writing about a war just after it's finished and your whole life's been geared, in the case of Bosnia, for the previous kind of 3 years of that conflict. And then afterwards, this kind of odd nostalgia for it and this missing and this kind of yearning for it and everything that was there for you in the war at the time as a young man, the excitement of it, the involvement, the engagement, the sense of meaning, yeah. And so it was written in the aftermath of the war's end,
It's
feeling kind of sad about the war ending. And that was my war gone by. Felt, it was mine. It was something very personal, and as I wrote those words, and I miss it. So it was, I missed it, and it sounded a weird sentence, and I wrote it and I liked it, so I used it as the title.
That was some sort of whimsical quote from Yeats or something.
Yeah,
but
sure,
it's,
it was mine.
It's yours forever. I'll give it to you. We'll call up the Oxford Dictionary of quotations. Yeah. But it really sums up, whether you're a journalist who's done embed, or a war correspondent on your own, or a soldier who's come back from a tour of duty that involved conflict. There is that most extraordinary thing, I've had it, not as many times as you have, of almost depression, where the adrenaline isn't running anymore. You're mighty pleased you got home alive, and you got some stories in the paper where it might be, but life just feels dull as a result, and it's addictive. It's worryingly addictive. I haven't done as much as you at all, but that title really nailed it. And I guess, is that the reason you keep going back?
It changes. It changes. I started off in the game, as it were, out of a sense of adventure. And it's fine to say as a young guy, I wanted the adventure and the excitement. So I was really curious. In war, my dad had been a soldier. My grandfathers had been one an airman and one a soldier, and then back, all soldiers. So it wasn't that I had to join the army, but I kind of subconsciously thought this is part of what you do as a young guy.
A great-grandfather who won the Victoria Cross in the First World War.
Yeah. It changes with age. I started off really motivated by a sense of curiosity and adventure, and some of that still remains. I still have the hunger for the adventure, and I still have the curiosity. I'm still interested. But one does, as one gets older, one gets naturally more altruistic. One's sense of risk, aptitude for risk changes as well. One sees the world slightly in different colours. One's emotional filters change a bit. Why do I still do it? I do it because, the excitement, the adventure is still there, and I'm interested, but I think to a degree, probably over-exaggerated by the media, but certainly to a degree, the job matters. I'm kind of good at it, and I like it, and I feel often comfortable in a conflict. I wouldn't overload that, but often comfortable in a conflict.
Comfortable?
I kind of know where I am in a conflict, and yes, I know what I'm doing. I'm thinking about how to manage what I'm doing in this and what this situation's about. And in a peacetime environment, it's kind of like different missions. Wake up, feed the chickens, feed the dogs, make sure my kid's all right, and all the rest of it. It's very different. But outside that, professionally, it can be, a bit more sort of pensive and sort of, hey, what's all this about in the supermarket,
Well, look, let's move on to the point of the day. The subject being why some wars are really interesting to the public, others just pass them by. Let's go at this by comparing two, if we can. Sudan and Ukraine. The former, not very well covered, quite frankly. The latter, huge coverage and huge interest in. So can we talk about Sudan first? Just to introduce people to conflict if they don't know much about it. You were there in December. It's one of the 15 or so wars you've covered, of course. Can you just give us a brief outline of the war? What is it about? When did it start?
So the war began in April 2023 between two generals who had been allies, General al-Burhan, who was commander-in-chief of the Sudanese Armed Forces, otherwise known as the SAF, and a guy who's best known as Hemeti, General Dagalo. And he was commander of the Rapid Support Forces, which originally drew their roots from the kind of Janjaweed of earlier conflicts, militia forces in Darfur in the west of the country. Now, these two had shared power. They fell out in April 2023, starting off in Khartoum, the capital, where fighting broke out and then spread very quickly throughout the country. So Sudan, it's often called a war of two generals. It's a bit more than that because it's got lots of regional backers as well. So we're talking about one of Africa's biggest countries. We've got millions displaced, well over 150,000 dead, probably way, way, way more than that. Famine declared in various areas of the country and famine threatened elsewhere. And it is the worst ongoing humanitarian disaster caused by war in the world. There's no sign really of it ending at all. The country's broken in two distinct halves at the moment, and it's very unclear how or if it's going to end anytime soon.
And as you alluded to, it's made worse by the fact that both the different generals have significant backing from big powers in the region, regional superpowers, if you like.
Absolutely. You've got every neighbouring country to Sudan committing one way or another.
So who's backing who?
Well, the big players, you've got the UAE backing the RSF and Hemeti loosely. They're challenged by it. There's a lot of gold for guns going on, and it's a big backing. Then you've got the Russians who sort of changed sides. They're looking for warm war support, so they're near Port Sudan, and they are leaning more now to al-Burhan and Sudanese armed forces. Then you've got the Egyptians as well, al-Burhan supporting them, but then you've got the Chadians supporting loosely, well, no, not so much loosely, you've got the Chadian government supporting the RSF out in the west. Then you've got all sorts of neighbouring countries as well supporting one actor or another, or sending men and weapons in, usually in return for gold coming out.
Right. I mean, there's an awful lot going on there.
There's an awful lot going on there.
And perhaps that's why it's such a substantial mess. So Sudan has been riddled by civil war since its independence from Britain way back in 1956. But over the last 2 years particularly, it has been a really horrific war. And the numbers, you said a few of them there, they're absolutely astonishing, biblical in proportion of horror. 14 million people displaced, 150,000 have died, and that's possibly a significant underestimation as well. It's very hard to know how many really. Half the population, 25 million, now facing starvation, and a cholera epidemic underway, according to the WHO. 100,000 cases this year so far. Horrific numbers. And yet, The Economist did a really interesting piece last year, and they worked out all the different wars and all the different coverage they got and all different sort of papers, etc., and TV channels around the world. Sudan averaged roughly 600 news stories a month globally. 600 a month globally. Now, compare that to both Gaza and Ukraine. Each of them rarely dipped below 200,000 news stories a month. I think there was 1 month in 2024, December, where Ukraine just dipped below 200,000 stories about it. An astoundingly large difference. Does that surprise you, hearing those numbers?
Not totally. It's quite depressing, given the effort that I put into. It wasn't all my effort. I was working with a videographer here, Federica de Correa. We had an amazing translator who was a Sudanese journalist in his own right, and a fantastic driver too. We had to put a lot of effort into getting there because it's a very complicated place to get to northern Khartoum as we were then. Khartoum's since been entirely recaptured by the Sudanese armed forces, but when we were there, the battle was going on in Khartoum. So to get there, we had to drive.
Where did you fly to, Djibouti?
No, flew into Port Sudan, and then we got a vehicle with the right driver. We had a good driver, and we had to drive, I think it was 800 miles across the desert to get to Omdurman. Based ourselves there. Omdurman was the scene of fighting, but it's kind of like, if you're staying on the blocks on the northwestern side, you're kind of okay. And then as you went further in, nearer the Nile, with Khartoum just the other side of the river, then the fighting got more severe. And it was hot. It wasn't the worst time of the year to go, but it was hot. There was fighting. It was low intensity, but there was a lot of it. And to work there intensively and then get back and write, file, we made a film, and then realize that, well, actually, there's not so many people reading this story, despite the magnitude of the issues we are describing, the death toll, the disease. We covered rape, sexual violence, and the war itself, the death of children, the death of adults, and the torture of prisoners. And yet, it didn't have anything like, I'm not saying the impact, but the readership that a story from Ukraine would have done.
You know that from the data numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, in fairness to the Times, it was on the front page.
In fairness to the Times, they sent me there, it was made prominent, we did a good job, but how much actual reader engagement was there?
Yeah.
I don't know. And that's not always how you judge something. I mean, I was happy we'd been sent there. I thought we did a good job. But in terms of the amount of people who actually engaged with what we did for the reasons you've described, or as part of the pattern you've described, no, far less than if you write about Ukraine.
And we're going to get on to why. Then our next conflict, Ukraine. So I think a lot of people know the story of Ukraine. Russia, in part, invaded the east and took Crimea in the south in 2014. Full-scale invasion February 2022. An appallingly bitter war as Ukraine fought the Russians back, and then effectively a 750-mile long front line pretty much has stayed the same for the last couple of years. So that's where Ukraine is now, and we all know all about that. You've been there a lot. You first went in 2014?
I first went in 2014, just the Russians were taking over Crimea and Donetsk, yeah.
How's it changed in the 10, 11 or so years you've been covering it, the war in Ukraine?
Well, since the full-scale invasion, it's interesting. A lot of people say it's similar to the First World War. And in some ways, the death toll and the attritional figures are the same. But it's also an entirely modern war. I mean, now you've got the advent of the drone, and particularly the suicide drone, has made the battlefield quite unlike any previous battlefield. Everything's transparent from about a 20-kilometre range either side of the front line. So it's 40-kilometre wide band that both sides can basically see each other. You're not going to surprise someone with a sudden armoured attack or anything like that, because they can see your tanks coming miles away and probably destroy them before the form-up point. You can't get a vehicle really within 5 kilometres of the front. If you get an infantry soldier into a foxhole, most of the trenches have now been obliterated by artillery fire, so it's usually foxholes. If you get an infantry soldier into a foxhole, he might be there for 40 days, he might be there for 50 days, because you can't get him out again very easily. How do you resupply him? You resupply him with agricultural drones, dropping him water, food, munitions. What does that do to a guy when he's been in a foxhole for 50 days? Well, you have to get him out and rebuild him psychologically for quite a long time before you can put him back in that position. So the whole pace of the war has been altered. The whole pattern of how you resupply humans has been altered. What it does to a human when you get them out, how long before you can send them back in, all that has been altered. So on the one hand, these quite slow-moving front lines with the most incredible death count and casualty count, and on the other hand, this very, very dystopian kind of modern war where the machines from the sky do most of the killing, and most of the soldiers are killed by drones. Yeah. They're killed by suicide drones, which are laden with explosives and rammed directly into them. That's how most of them are killed.
And that extraordinary advent of technology, digital technology, is you've chronicled that over the 10 years. That's the great change. But look, the numbers then, similar to Ukraine, sort of horrific proportions. So 100,000 Ukrainians killed, roughly 400,000 casualties in total. And
Soldiers.
It's soldiers, we should say, yeah. Civilians also killed.
Civilians also, but not to a comparative number of civilians as killed in Syria.
Yeah. 1 million Russian casualties, more than roughly 200,000 dead. Russians don't declare the fatalities, so we don't know, but that's the best guesstimate. So the sort of numbers, similar scale to Sudan, maybe more people killed in Ukraine, but certainly more displaced and made refugees in Sudan. But vast amounts of human suffering in both wars ongoing. But the numbers, as we were discussing, 200,000 news stories a month on Ukraine. I've got this chart from The Economist that we're looking at now. Over the year 2024, almost 300,000 stories a month, only dropped to below 200,000 in 1 month. Gaza, a similar sort of proportion when that really exploded. But then, I'm now showing you these charts. Yemen, a peak when everyone got interested, when Donald Trump got himself elected and started hurling missiles around, and then that dropped off. Sudan, almost nothing. Myanmar, a vicious, vicious war against the persecution of the Rohingya, almost nothing. Syria, less fighting now than back in your time, but almost nothing again. The disparities are extraordinary. So, why? Let's move on to that. What is your first take on why someone like Ukraine gets such vast blanket coverage and Sudan gets all but ignored?
There are a number of reasons why Ukraine particularly gets such engagement from readers, from the public here. First of all, at its extreme end, the war there poses some sort of sense of existential threat to people here, by which I mean people in Britain and people in Europe. Ukraine is part of Europe, it's close, relatively speaking. People have an understanding that if the war goes really wrong, they could turn into kind of radiated dust. If it goes really, really wrong, it could turn into a nuclear confrontation. Now, that's the extreme case, but it's a rational fear to have. So, primarily, people, I think, are interested because, wow, if this war goes really badly wrong, it's conceivable that I could die. So that's one thought.
This could affect me.
This could affect me more than there not being good supplies of mustard or whatever, because the Ukrainian wheat can't be used for mustard or whatever. Mustard stocks have been affected throughout Europe.
Okay.
But then there's many, many other reasons, geographically close, as I said. People have a cultural, possibly religious, and also race sense of affinity with Ukrainians if I think they're white Europeans, because they're like, well, there are many similar cultural reference points. They're loosely the same religion for white European Christians. They're not so far away. They're part of Europe. We can identify with them through the prisms I've just described, perhaps more easily than people in Sudan. For some people, that will be a very real definition. And there's a sense of general awareness where Kiev, if you ask many readers, look, can you mark Port Sudan on the map? Can you mark Khartoum on the map? Can you roughly draw where Sudan is? And tell us when, it stopped being a British colony. A lot of people would be very confused by that. And so I'm not describing something that is racist. I'm describing the prisms through which people look at a conflict and the association they have with the people there, or the feelings they have, sometimes displaced, sometimes, misplaced, should I say, sometimes perfectly understandable. And then you've got a fairly traditional concept here of Russians over, the Cold War years and since as potentially a threat. And so people will gravitate quite naturally to supporting Ukraine and interpreting the Russians as a threat.
So a sort of historical comfort blanket. Well, Russians are bad, Ukrainian are good, and also there's the David Goliath thing going on, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Versus smaller guys.
Absolutely. Victimhood. One guy's the aggressor, invading a sovereign country, and the other guys are the defenders. And we seem to, the defenders want to be part of Europe. They like us. They want to be part of us. They want to be part of NATO. And the invaders, don't like NATO and don't want Ukraine to be part of us. So there is a natural breakdown, much more complicated in Sudan. If you say to people here, okay, well, there were two generals. They used to be allied. Neither was a friend of democracy. Then they fell apart in a power-sharing grab that went wrong. And since then, the country is divided largely west to east, with a whole lot of tribal dynamic as well. And it involves partial fighting. We don't really know exactly how many people have been killed. Then lots and lots of people have died through malnutrition rather than starvation. But some have died of starvation too. And it involves a lot of names like El Fasher, the city of El Fasher out in the west. We'll ask one of our readers to put El Fasher on the map. You never do that. So it seems more distant to them, more complex. And there's less of an easily definable good and bad, which people like in a story, even though very few wars are defined actually literally between good and bad.
The good guys, bad guys, the guys in the black hats, the guys in the white hats from the old cowboy movies. But Gaza's an interesting example, though, isn't it, to your point of having an affinity and emotional connection, because Gaza is further away from Britain, a long way away from America. To your point, there's less cultural affinities, and yet there's huge amounts of interest in what's going on in Gaza now on the streets of America. I was walking through New York City about a month back, and there were people literally fighting each other, a pro-Israeli group in Union Square fighting a pro-Palestinian group. And they were all Americans, all New Yorkers, but they were so angry with each other. But that seems to be about because we know the story. There's a huge amount of knowledge about the Middle East. Is that the difference between, say, Gaza and Sudan?
Gaza's closer. We've got a huge amount of knowledge. People's understanding of Britain's involvement in the history of Palestine, the division of the Middle East, is generally much fresher than our involvement in Sudan. Then the interest was galvanized during the October the 7th terrorist attack by Hamas. And then
you couldn't but be
horrified by. And then the subsequent Israeli attack on Gaza, which you couldn't help but be horrified by either. Looking at the toll of civilian harm, any right-minded person is horrified by that and questioning naturally, is this something we support, or is this something our government should support, and where actually does it lead to, and what is going on here? What is the outcome here? Now, particularly with images of children suffering acute malnutrition and in some cases starvation. And starvation has a particular impact on viewers and readers when they see human beings, images of human beings who are beginning to starve to death. That has far more of an emotional weight and impact on people than often statistics related to 65 Palestinians, for example, have been killed today while trying to get food. People here listen to it. They hear it as almost a fait accompli. Those are appalling figures, which overall now are more than 60,000 people, maybe 80 or 90,000 people in total. No one's quite sure. And it has happened. Whereas when they see an image of a starving child, a reader or a viewer will think, this is happening. That child is not yet dead. There is something perhaps that could be done to save that child. And there is a stronger emotional response, I would argue, at times to images of starving adults and children than to figures of how many Palestinians have been killed. But make no mistake, I think in an earlier conversation we were talking, well, people have been familiar with the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis for years and years and years. But the state of the war now has galvanized people's attention and people's emotion in largely different camps all across the land. I mean, certainly in my family, Gaza is a subject of conversation every day, every single day.
Everybody has a view. I mean, your point about starving children there, and there's no better example of that, is the Michael Burke's reporting in the mid-1980s from Ethiopia.
1984, Horn of Africa, exactly. And many people fear
of those refugee camps of tiny young children looking terribly, terribly ill, terribly malnourished, dying of starvation, and that created Live Aid.
Many people fear that the conflict in Sudan will result in a famine of the same proportions as the one in the Horn of Africa you were describing in 1984. Wow. But it seems very hard to trigger the response. And I'm not just talking about Times readers. I mean, the UN's appeal for aid for Sudan last year reached only something like 57% of what was actually promised was coughed up in terms of cash for humanitarian aid for Sudan. And, many people fear that malnutrition will turn into famine of a large scale before there is a response. That you won't actually get people to respond in time to prevent that. For all the reasons we've described, there seems to be less emotional engagement with that conflict.
But it sometimes can turn on a trigger of incredibly powerful emotive reporting, especially when it involves children. And there's another point you made that was really interesting. If it has some sort of political element to it, as in the British government, the American government, the American citizen, has some sort of dog in the fight, and it either should have a bigger one or none at all, that's another trigger for audiences, isn't it? So
for British audiences, a conflict that involves British troops.
We're friends with Israelis. British. Sorry, we should say British troops. If British troops are involved, then suddenly everybody's interested because they could be someone's brother or sister. But if we've got a relationship with the Israeli government, and perhaps we should have a better one, or no one at all, as many people are now saying, then you got a political
absolutely
injection that get people.
They question that relationship one way or another. Some people are for that relationship, and other people say, "Hang on, why are we giving the Israelis weapons and surveillance flights? Why have we with this relationship?" We're talking in all the instances we've described about ultimately one's sense of relatedness to other people involved in a war. And in Ukraine, as I've described, there's quite a strong sense of relatedness. In Sudan, it seems further. In Gaza and Israel, there is definitely a sense of relatedness of one type or another. And then there are times when there is an override switch, the Horn of Africa in 1984, where it doesn't matter that people aren't very familiar with Ethiopia or Eritrea. Suddenly it's like, God, there are hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation. That is something as human beings we would like to help.
There is also that. And then there's some other interesting theories. I think you have one word for it, compassion fatigue. Melissa Fleming, who's the Undersecretary General for Communications at the UN, she called it psychic numbing. What is that?
For me, compassion fatigue means when your viewer or your reader becomes so saturated by reports or images of violence and suffering in a conflict that they switch off. That is combined with a sense of helplessness, that they can't do anything about it. And I think that from time to time that is happening now. In Gaza, some people sporadically switch off until there's some spasm of new sort of ultra-violence there, because there is a sense that people here appear not to be able to do anything about it. It happens to some degree in every protracted conflict. We're not quite at the sense of compassion fatigue with Ukraine yet, but there are definitely long lull periods when people sense, gosh, that conflict's been going on for ages and we don't really seem to be able to do much about it.
Yeah. I mean,
The antidote to compassion fatigue was something in Bosnia we used to call the CNN factor. At the time, Bosnia was a very, very interesting war that actually drew in a lot of European powers one way or another, certainly drew in NATO and the US ultimately, but it rolled on for the best part of 3 years before that happened. And yet every now and then, a slightly different relationship with the media and governments at the time, but something like an atrocity would happen in Sarajevo. I can think twice of the shelling by Serbs of marketplaces in Sarajevo, which would result in a huge death toll. And there would be these incredibly graphic pictures of dozens of people, lying dead across the marketplace and injured and raw grief. And that would be captured by journalists, and that would trigger instance of what we call the CNN factor, where governments would be influenced. And you can argue that the actual NATO airstrikes finally against the Bosnian Serbs in late 1995, which really contributed to ending the war, were triggered in no small part by the second Markeli massacre, which happened in central Sarajevo in that summer when Serb mortar shells killed, I think, 48 or 50 people. And the TV images resulting from that, it resulted in a very emotional response in Europe and in America. And people saying, hey, can't we stop this? Which had a political knock-on effect. Now, it's a bit more diluted these days for all sorts of reasons. The relationship between governments and the media has changed. The relationships between viewers, readers, and the media has changed. But certainly thinking 30 years ago, there was compassion fatigue. And there was also the antidote, which was the CNN factor, as we used to call it.
Related to that, there's also the sheer number of conflicts today. There are more wars, in fact, now than in a year since the Second World War. And for some people, it's just too much. I mean, I've got friends, great friends who read the paper every day or subscribe and read the Times every day or another paper, who have just stopped listening to Times Radio or Today program in the morning and just have Virgin on. They just can't bear to hear anymore. They just don't want to be made miserable. I mean, it depresses me that is the case, but I can't blame them in a way.
It used to really rankle with me when 10 years ago I used to hear people say, I never watch the news, I find it too depressing. Mm-hmm. And I used to think, God, how dumb, how ignorant, the desire to not be informed. Whereas now when people say, I don't listen to the news, I don't watch the news, I don't read the news, I find it too depressing, I do understand why. I think the position of reclusion is quite an understandable position in the world at the moment.
Because just there's so much horrific news out there.
There's so much horrific news out there, and there is a sense of impotence. There's a sense of this kind of soaking up, this horror, this suffering, this violence, without any recourse to doing anything about it.
The final element of all this, Ant, is media coverage. Obviously, a lot of media coverage helps. No one's talking about the war, how are people supposed to know about it? So that begs the question, is it our fault? And that's the chicken and the egg going, isn't it? Is it our fault for not covering wars? Or is it, as editors, journalists, etc., we think, well, people aren't going to be interested in that, we won't give them that coverage? Who's to blame?
It's very difficult to say. News is a business. News is a business. What appeals to readers, at what point it appeals to readers, one has to inform. But at the same time, particularly with protracted news covering operations, there is naturally editorial judgment placed on what conflicts are our readers interested in and what are they less interested in. If I said, can I go and spend 2 months covering the conflict in Sudan, I'll be told, no, don't. That will be too expensive, too complicated, potentially too dangerous for the actual engagement that our readers would have with it. If I said, really, I want to go and spend 2 months in Ukraine, well, there'll be a lot of other journalists who want to be there as well, but the interest is protracted.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that is the commercial reality. We've got to earn a living, most of us, unless you're the BBC, of course, and they're funded by the taxpayer. Finally, I need to let you go. It's difficult sometimes, isn't it, when you cover these sorts of wars, to not get personally involved, isn't it? So Afghanistan, for example, where I spent quite a bit of time, largely as an embedded journalist with military units, I was so angry by the withdrawal, by Trump, Biden pulling out America, leaving Afghans helpless to the Taliban's return and all the horrendous sort of Stone Age brutalities that you and I saw in 2001 and now back. I was so furious about it. I was unable to report objectively. You must have had that experience yourself. And what's the one conflict you've covered that's had the most effect on you personally over the years?
How funny, I had a different reaction to Afghanistan. Despite the amount of time I'd spent there, I thought by 2021 it was time to go. And I thought we'd actually ended up bringing incredible suffering and supported an incredibly corrupt government, and the situation was getting worse and worse, which it was. And whereas now there is some sort of peace there, not the kind of peace we would like, not the kind of peace which many Afghans want, but many Afghans are happier with that peace. They're like, hey, you tried to bring us democracy and you brought us war. Now there's peace and we've lost our freedom. But, what's affected me most? I mean, I suppose when I was young, the Bosnian War was my formative experience of my life, and my formative war. It was where I went as a young man, the first proper war I'd ever been in.
So the point you've been unable to actually cover it objectively, you've been so angry by what you're seeing, you can't be fair and balanced.
I don't know. Maybe I'm quite compartmentalised, and I can't think of a place where I've been unable to report. I'm not a cold person, but I can compartmentalise quite easily. It can be hard. I tell you what I find most difficult, it's not to do with the overall conflict, it's working in a conflict, building up very close relationships with a local team you work with, and then leaving them to their war as you fly back home. I find that tough, but it's not beyond my capability to do. Yeah, and I feel more or less guilty about it at different times. I mean, but I do it, and I have to get used to that. A friend of mine said, I'm not paid to break down, and I adhere to that. I'm not here to have an emotional hemorrhage. I'm here to work and report.
And that's what probably makes you quite good at it, Anthony. There we must end. That is it for today. Anthony, thank you so much for that. It's been absolutely fascinating. We could have talked for another 3 hours. We have to stop because you've got to go to Ukraine tomorrow. So the very best of luck there. I hope it goes well. And come back and see Patrick and I when you return.
I'd love to. Till then, thanks.
Now, if you have a question or just want to tell us something, email Patrick and I at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. We read all of them, and we'll feature some of the best ones in episodes to come, or in the Times' new weekly newsletter on geopolitics called War and Peace, which is written by me. Thanks so much for listening.